inviting Daniela Urosa to present the case study on electoral reforms in Venezuela. Daniela, please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much, Darko, and thank you so much, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this panel. I'm sharing my screen. I want to be sure that everybody can see my screen.
Yeah, right.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, as Darko mentioned, I have the opportunity to share with you the case study of Venezuela. In the case of Venezuela, we have named our paper or work as the role of electoral reform in the electoral authoritarianism in Venezuela. Basically, because we consider that in Venezuela, we have currently an electoral authoritarianism, and the electoral reform has played a key role in that sense. As a summary, we would love to share with you today, first, a very brief introduction regarding how in Venezuela we have had a democratic backlash, and how in the last 20 years and how the autocratic legalism has played a key role, and the electoral reform has been part of that autocratic legalism. Second, let's review how the electoral reforms in Venezuela have been during the democratic decline in these last 20 years in order to facilitate the case study that we have named the role of the electoral reform and delegalization in restricting voting abroad for the 2024 presidential election. After that, we will try to examine this case abroad and the restriction of the voting from abroad in Venezuela during the 2024 presidential election from the lens of the principles for democratic electoral reform processes or electoral reform principles. And finally, some conclusion. Well, just to start, let's say that in the last 2 decades, or maybe a little more, Venezuela has regressed from being a constitutional democracy to a competitive autocracy, and ultimately to a consolidated authoritarian regime. So Venezuela was once one of the pioneer constitutional democracies in Latin America, one of the first democracies during the mid-20th century. However, in the past 20 years, the country has experienced a severe democratic crisis characterized by a substantial decline of the rule of law and electoral integrity. In the last 6 or 7 years, Venezuela has been ranked in the last place in the electoral, in the rule of law index in the world, so worldwide, and the ranked place in the Americas and in the lowest 10 worldwide in the Electoral Integrity Global Report 2024. So the situation of lack of democracy and rising authoritarianism has been increasing in Venezuela in the last 20 or 25 years. As part of that democratic decline has been crucial, the autocratic legalism. When we talk about autocratic legalism, we are trying to describe the situation where the use, abuse, or non-use of the law and institutions in service of the executive branch or in favor of authoritarianism. And that autocratic legalism has been very clear in different situations. The first one has been the political control of the electoral arbitrator, the CNE. The electoral arbitrator lacks independence and impartiality since 20 or 25 years ago. Second, the political control of electoral justice courts, specifically the electoral chamber and the constitutional chamber, both of the Supreme Tribunal. And third, we have had abusive reforms to electoral rules facilitating non-competitive elections that do not comply with the electoral principles. Probably the momentum of this electoral backlash was the 2024 presidential election. During that election, it was considered an electoral fraud when most of the votes were for the opposition candidate, González. However, the electoral arbitrator and the electoral justice bodies declare that Maduro, the opposition candidate and current president, was considered reelected. Well, just to have a brief panorama of the electoral reforms in Venezuela during the democratic decline in the last 20 years. Well, just to say that the lack of electoral conditions and independent institutions in Venezuela are related to the electoral reforms. So in Venezuela, the rules or electoral rules have different ranks. We have electoral rules in the constitutions, the general and rules are in the constitution. Second, we have also primary legislation, specifically in the organic law of electoral power that organize the electoral bodies, and second, the organic law of electoral processes that is named the LOPRE, and with the point of regulate the main aspects of the electoral processes and the main guarantees during of the political rights in the electoral process. However, we have also mainly secondary legislation for electoral rules in Venezuela. Or in other words, most of the rules, of the electoral rules, are regulated by the CNE, by the electoral arbitrators, because of the delegation of the legislation in the electoral arbitrator. We name that delegation a delegalization because it is not only a delegation, it is a legislative function that, according to the Constitution, should be exercised by the legislator. However, it was delegated in the electoral arbitrator with the purpose of having more easily electoral rules change, usually contrary to the electoral principles, especially electoral consensus, as we will try to explain very quickly. In sum, I would say that most of the electoral reforms in these 25 years has lacked the compliance with the electoral principles. One of them, the 2009 constitutional amendment, was very, that lack was very clear. That 2009 constitutional amendment allowed the indefinite reelection of the president and had a direct impact on electoral matters in Venezuela democratic decline. After that constitutional amendment, it has been an indefinite reelection of the first President Chavez and then President Maduro. So in 25 years, we only have had two presidents. That constitutional amendment was not only contrary to main principles of the Constitution, so we could say that it was an unconstitutional constitutional amendment, but also in terms of procedure, it was a constitutional fraud. And I can say that because 1 year before, through through a constitutional reform, the parliament tried to include the indefinite presidential reelection. However, that constitutional reform was denied by referendum. And 1 year later, trying to avoid that denegation, it was enacted a constitutional amendment only to approve the indefinite presidential reelection. So the procedure was not according to the Constitution and was not according to the electoral principle. A second one, electoral reform, was the LOPRE, the Organic Law for Electoral Procedures in 2009. That law, that is, as I mentioned before, the main legislation in Venezuela for electoral rules, also lacked consensus and political pluralism. Only two political parties approved that legislation. Both political parties were pro the government parties, and no opposition party and no participation of the civil society was part of the 2009 LOPRE. In third place, we should mention the delegalization of the electoral rules in Venezuela. As I mentioned before, most of the electoral rules in Venezuela are enacted by the CNE, by the electoral arbitrator. The electoral arbitrator, in one hand, approved the general rules of the electoral processes in a main secondary legislation body, but then also in every ongoing electoral process, during the process, the CNE usually approved and modify rules without compliance with the principles. That's what we, as mentioned before, we name the delegalization of the electoral rules. Finally, maybe we should mention that there is a recent shift in the role of electoral reform in the consolidation of electoral authoritarianism in Venezuela, and is the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election. After this mentioned electoral fraud during the 2024 presidential election, I think it was clear for the current regime that even though having a lack of electoral condition, and even though having a lack of guarantees of impartiality during the process, the opposition candidates can win elections. Therefore, in September 2024, it was announced a comprehensive electoral reform that is trying to include not only a reform in a constitutional reform, including electoral rules in the constitution, but also in the main electoral legislation in the country. This is still an ongoing legislative reform that probably will finish in the next few months. But at the end, this reform also lacks compliance with the electoral principles. Well, trying to descend all these considerations to our case study, I would love to bring as an example of the problematic that occurs because of the lack of compliance of electoral reform principles, is the role of the electoral reform and delegalization in restricting voting abroad for the 2024 presidential elections. The CNE, so in general, let's start saying that the voting abroad is permitted in Venezuela since many years ago. However, it has always been in a limited capacity. According to the Venezuelan law, only can vote abroad those Venezuelans that has residency in a foreign country or that have any permanence in that country. So the law says, or any regime that denotes legality of permanence out of Venezuela. So not only according to the law, not only those who are formal resident in other countries, but also those who are asylum seekers or refugees or with a temporary permit could vote from abroad. However, the electoral arbitrators' rules have limited even more and more the requirements to voting from abroad. It happened in the last national elections, but it was even worse during the 2024 presidential elections. These changes were enacted through regulations and singular acts of the CNE, implemented without considering the electoral principles, as we will try to explain later. The result has been reforms that severely limited the voting rights of millions of Venezuela living abroad. So we are talking about that Venezuela has a diaspora of almost 8 million of citizens. Those 8 million, that diaspora is the worst migration crisis in the history of Latin America, and the second worst migration crisis in the world in the last few years after Syria. From those 8 million Venezuelans living abroad, 5 million of them are potential voters. However, only 1% of them can vote abroad due to the extreme restrictions of the CNE. That limitation, of course, is in favor of the ruling party and its candidate, since most of the votes abroad are against the regime. Perhaps to, since we only have a few more minutes, let me try to analyze the limitations imposed on voting abroad from the lens of the electoral principles. Well, I think that the restrictions on voting abroad in Venezuela is an example of how in the country, the lack of applications of the principles has led to worsening conditions of electoral integrity and has increased the lack of competitiveness in the elections. In the 2024 presidential election framework, the voting from abroad, as I said before, was even more restricted than in previous election that was already very restricted. It has been a consequence of a change of lack of, in the first place, lack of political consensus building, because the restriction of voting abroad was imposed through rules that double lack political consensus. First, they were imposed by the electoral arbitrator, the CNE, which is a body that it is not impartial and has not a balanced representation of different political tendencies. Only, so the majority of the electoral body are part of the official party. And also, there were imposed through secondary legislation that did not comply with the procedure of the formation of legislative rules as it should be according to Venezuelan constitution. Second, we can see clearly a lack of transparency. In the case study, the CNE imposed new restrictions on voting abroad, such as the requirement of permanent legal residence in the host country and additional documents proving that residency and identification of the voters, for example, labor permits, for example, IDs in the receiving country that were not included in any published document. It was not an official requirement according to the Venezuelan rules. In consequences, it was very difficult for the Venezuelan living abroad to know clearly what were the rules and how to comply with those rules if possible. Third, it was a lack of inclusivity, very clear. First, because so the principle of inclusivity, according to which those groups belonging to minority sectors or in vulnerable conditions should be considered or should participate, was clearly restricted. Particularly a group affected was the young new voters group. The changes made by the CNE prevented those who have come of age in recent years from being able to register and vote abroad, even though they are more approximately 2 million of voters. Third, there was a definitely lack of supportive evidence or empirical data. The regulations have been completely devoid of debate, technical support, or concrete data to explain why they should be limited, why the vote from abroad should be limited to those with legal formal resident, or why an automated voter registration couldn't be possible. Also,
Daniela, 1 minute.
okay,
1 minute.
wonderful. The lack of accountability structures, basically because there is not, even though the jury in Venezuela, we have clear ways for accountability, especially in electoral justice. De facto, we don't have any independent body. Therefore, it is not possible to challenge or to overrule these rules. And finally, the lack of time frame and resources. So the rules on how to register to vote abroad and what requirements the voters had to meet to do so were imposed to be fulfilled in just a few days or weeks before the election. So it was not possible to comply timely with those requirements. Just as a brief conclusion, to say that the dramatic democratic backlash in Venezuela over the last 20 years is a consequence of the lack of a separation of power and the sustained decline of electoral integrity conditions. And one indicator of the autocratic legalism in the country has been the implementation of abusive electoral reforms that facilitate a non-competitive and very contentious elections in the recent years. The Venezuelan electoral reforms in the last 2 decades have consistently failed to adhere to the electoral principles, but even more in the recent election through specifically the electoral delegalization, and a clear case study is the case of the voting from abroad for Venezuelans that reached its most critical point during the 2024 presidential elections. These restrictions ignore all the principles, particularly political consensus, transparency, inclusivity, and accountability. And this lack of compliance of the principles has severely limited the voting rights of millions of Venezuelans, almost 5 million of Venezuelans living outside of the country. Well, I will stop here and thank you so much, and I am happy to receive any question or comment.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for the insightful and rather in-depth presentation. And I am almost certain that Emre will have feedback with his discussion on it, and that it has provoked most of our participants to ask questions at the end and have a debate around it. So thank you for the effort, and thank you for the presentation and for the paper. Next we have Rekai with the case study on Zimbabwe. Rekai, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me try and share my screen. Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Rekai. I'm from Zimbabwe, and today my presentation is going to be focusing on electoral reform in Zimbabwe. My 20-year review period starts from 2004. So I'll be looking at the period from 2004 to 2024 for the 20-year review period. And then I'll focus on an internal case study where I will look at the process that was followed by Zimbabwe in trying to amend its electoral act between 2018 when it had an election and 2024. But I'm going to go back in history as far back as the colonial period in Zimbabwe, because I think there are some important facts to highlight that are going to be illuminating in the discussion of electoral reforms that I will then get into. So first, Zimbabwe was colonized by Britain. So the colonial period was from 1890 to 1980. 90 years of colonization. And obviously, colonization by its nature was authoritarian. So during the colonial period, Black-led political parties were banned. They could not participate in politics, including the current ruling party in Zimbabwe. It is both a victim of what was happening to political parties that were led by Black people at that time, and a product of those struggles too. So the Black majority could not vote until 1979, when the government at that particular point in time tried to avoid a transition to majority rule by holding an election, but then in which the major opposition political parties that happened to be those parties that were former liberation movements did not participate. So that election was not recognized as legitimate across the world. And Zimbabwe then had its independence elections in 1980. But I want to highlight that even the 1980 elections were not free and fair, though of course they were validated by a number of international observers as having been free and fair. After independence, the first post-colonial decade from 1980 up to 1990 saw power consolidation by the ruling party. So the ruling party made it clear that its preference was to have a one-party state. And they vigorously campaigned for that in the first post-colonial decade. Then constitutional amendments followed, including changing from the Westminster system, where they had a ceremonial president and a ceremonial president and a prime minister. They changed that in 1987, introducing the executive presidents. And there were quite a number of constitutional amendments that sought to empower the president. So civil society was co-opted for those organizations that were not already on the side of the state. And so I think the same thing happened with the opposition political party, the only one that has existed during this decade. They signed an agreement, they merged into one political party in 1987. But then there was the emergence of an opposition political party from the ruling party itself in 1989, which participated in the 1990 presidential elections and lost. Now, the second post-colonial decade, the idea of the one-party state, the legislated one-party state, was ultimately abandoned because there was a lot of domestic resistance. And I think, as most of you would know, there were also a lot of international pressures at this particular point in time working against the idea of the one-party state. So they abandoned that. Then there was a debate relating to constitutional amendments, electoral reform, I think starting from around 1994, 1995, thereabouts. And then within the ruling party itself, there was the unraveling of elite cohesion. And as a result, we had a number of people standing as independent candidates. And other political parties were formed, though all of them were very, very weak and didn't last. They didn't make any impact on the political landscape. And this decade also witnessed the worsening of the political crisis that had started earlier. And the same thing happened with the economy. And so civil society organizations, remember I said they were co-opted in the first decade. In this second decade after independence, they changed their stance from being cooperative, from being sympathetic, and then they began to challenge the government. And a constitutional movement was formed, which was called the National Constitutional Assembly in 1997. And their business was to advocate for constitutional reforms. And then the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, which is Zimbabwe's biggest domestic election observer group, was also formed in 1999. And in 1999, the strongest opposition that Zimbabwe has had emerged, which was the Movement for Democratic Change. 2000 to 2010, the ruling party lost for the first time in a constitutional referendum in 2000. So civil society and the political opposition campaigned for a no vote. The ruling party campaigned for a yes, and then the majority voted no. So this was the first time the ruling party was losing. Then in the elections that were held, parliamentary elections in that same year, 2000, the newly formed opposition won a number of, I think, about 57 seats in parliament, which was something that was quite significant. And authoritarianism deepened in this particular decade. So there were farm invasions in 2000 where war veterans invaded farms that had been taken over by whites during the colonial period. So they violently took back land, and that violence, I think, carried over to the elections that were held, both in 2000 and in 2002 when we had a presidential election. So sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe. There was the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act here in the United States of America, and some executive orders followed, basically imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe. Some other countries did the same: EU, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, the UK, trying to put pressure on Zimbabwe to reform. Some of this was election related. Some of it, it's argued, was related to the land reform. So Zimbabwe was suspended in 2002 from the Commonwealth after the 2000 election. When it was suspended, to put pressure on Zimbabwe to reform, what happened is Zimbabwe withdrew from the Commonwealth in 2003. And we had the SADC, a regional body of countries that are in Southern Africa, facilitating a dialogue in Zimbabwe between the ruling party and the opposition political party. We also had the opposition increasingly calling for electoral reforms, but the ruling party continued to resist electoral reforms. And in 2007, the dialogue that was facilitated by the SADC led to the adoption of a constitutional amendment. But the reforms that came with this constitutional amendment were those that were the opposite of what people had expected based on what the opposition had been calling for. So the opposition was criticized by civil society for that. In 2008, we had inconclusive elections leading to the formation of a government of national unity. So in the government of national unity, the opposition was expected to push for electoral reforms, but unfortunately it did not. So there's someone who said it became complacent in the GNU and lost the opportunity to push for electoral reforms. But it also appears as if it was played by the ruling party, because there was this committee, there was this caucus that was formed between the ruling party and the opposition. So they said we can't take legislation to parliament without that legislation first having been agreed on by this caucus of political parties. Yet at this particular point in time, the opposition had more seats than the ruling party in parliament. So I think that worked against what they could achieve in terms of trying to push for electoral reforms. Then the GNU came to an end with the 2013 elections, and the ruling party consolidated power once more. But around 2015, the regime sought re-engagement with the international community. So an interministerial task force was formed to align legislation to the constitution that had been adopted in 2013. But work on this proceeded slowly. And with respect to the Electoral Act in particular, the amendments were piecemeal. So they would introduce slow reforms, and they would not reform in terms of the fundamentals that people had been complaining about in terms of what was problematic in the way we were conducting elections. So the ruling party basically continued to resist calls for electoral reform. And in 2013, the SADC, the regional board I mentioned earlier, tried to put pressure on Zimbabwe to reform. So they said, you need to postpone the elections until such a time when you would have implemented reforms. And the response from the president at that time was, we are in SADC voluntarily, so we can pull out if SADC decides to do stupid things. And in 2015, a top ruling party official said about those who were calling for reforms, they will continue to do that while we continue to rule. 2016, a top ZANU-PF official, a ruling party official, said the party can't reform itself out of power, so we are not going to do that. And around 2018, the Minister of Justice said, well, we don't want to waste our time on cosmetic changes, because everything that these people are calling for is materially covered in the laws as they currently stand. And in 2017, we had a military coup that replaced the then President Robert Mugabe. So basically what was happening is the country was moving in an authoritarian direction. Now, 2019 to 2024, the ruling party doubled down on re-engagement efforts. So they really wanted to re-engage. The president even wrote to the Commonwealth before the 2018 elections. They wanted to be readmitted. They invited observers, international observers, especially the Western ones, had not observed elections in Zimbabwe since the early 2000s. They had been banned, but they were invited in 2018. So there were a lot of promising developments. They acknowledged the recommendations that were proffered by observers after the 2018 elections and promised to implement all those reforms. They wanted to re-engage, remember. Then there was the creation of a task force to work on political and electoral reforms, and a lot of other similar initiatives by the government. And what I want to focus on now, I'm now getting to the case study. There was this promising engagement with civil society from 2018. Yet the government engaged in parallel processes. So they embarked on a process where they said you want to reform the Electoral Act, amend the Electoral Act. Now there was a process that was led by civil society to do that, and then there was a process that was led by the government. The government was taking part in these processes at the same time. And at the last minute, they abandoned the process that was led by civil society and proceeded with their own. So civil society compiled all the recommendations that were proffered by election observers that observed the 2008 elections and produced a compendium of election observer mission recommendations. Based on that, they submitted a petition to Parliament on 3 December 2018, and they produced subsequently a proposed comprehensive electoral amendment bill. This was after the Speaker of Parliament, who had taken part in some of the workshops, having been invited by civil society, asked an organization called the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, which I mentioned was formed in 1999, to come up with a model law that it would then submit to Parliament, so that they could then, on the basis of that, pursue electoral reform. So there was engagement between the Parliament and civil society. The Minister of Justice was involved. The Electoral Commission was involved. the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee responsible for justice, legislation, and all that was involved in this process. And political parties were also involved. A lot of stakeholders. And this organization, the civil society organization, is a network of 36 governance-oriented non-governmental organizations, including those that focus on women issues, youth, disability, all that. So it was a very, very inclusive process. And I think the process went on and reached a point where they actually produced the final version or draft of this particular bill. But in the very last workshop, the Minister of Justice and the Electoral Commission were absent. They did not attend. So where the principles followed, they were not with respect to the law that ended up being enacted. Remember, I said they engaged in parallel processes. So they then adopted an electoral act that was a product of this process, which was not public, very public. Of course, civil society still participated in that process, but not as much as they were doing in the other process that they were leading. So there was no political consensus. The issues that had been deliberated on and the consensus that had been reached, where the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee that is responsible for justice was involved, which comprises of political parties, different political parties, that process was set aside. The same happened because the president created what was called Pollard in 2019 as a platform of smaller opposition political parties. In fact, it was intended to be of all political parties that had participated in 2018, that had fielded presidential candidates. So they also deliberated on electoral reforms, but their input was also discarded. There was no transparency in the government-led process. There was no inclusiveness in that process as well. And in terms of the timeframes, I would say civil society started just after the election in 2018, because in 2019, that's when they kickstarted the process. So there was a lot of time for them to do this. And by 2023, by 2022, sorry, before the 2023 election, they had produced the final draft. So there was time to adopt it if only there was political will, but that did not happen. Accountability was made difficult by the fact that this process was not one that was very transparent. Lastly, why were reforms not implemented over this period of time? So obviously, there is the lack of political will. Is those statements the courts that I presented would review. But I have some thoughts here regarding what could be the explanation for that lack of political will. So it could be that this is just that it's nothing more than power, this power retention incentive, that the ruling party wants to remain in power. So they are not prepared to reform. But they could also be resisting what they are calling neo-colonial or imperialistic maneuvers, because this is what they say about international organizations. Like these organizations that come to observe elections here are coming from these countries that have this relationship with this continent, right? So they're up to no good, really. This is what the regime says. And based on that, they try to do everything to resist. Remember, they adopted multi-partyism, not because they wanted it, but because of the pressure, as all of you here would probably know. That was coming, I said, from within their countries, but also outside, those democracy contingent benefits. So the problem, as I see it, is election observation, which is linked intimately with what we are discussing about here, electoral reform, is something that does not have an enforcement mechanism that is formal. So this is an international norm, and you expect the players to play fairly. You expect them to be motivated to hold free and fair elections. But you can't really force these countries or compel them to do this. So, for example, Zimbabwe would say, we are a sovereign country, so we don't want these people interfering in elections, which are a domestic affair. It said the same to the West. It said the same to SADC, the regional body, in 2013, right? So I think this is part of the challenge. And democracy, honestly, I think has not been the only game in town. So if that was the case, I think everyone was going to be compelled to reform in a manner that would ensure democratization. But Zimbabwe then, when the relations turned sour with the West, what they did is the president said, we are looking east. So they deepened their relationship with China, for example, and also Russia. And most recently, yeah.
1 minute.
1 minute, that's okay, thank you. Most recently, what happened is the president also went to Russia and he was seeking to further deepen again the relations with Zimbabwe, mentioning that the US, for instance, is doing the same with other countries surrounding Zimbabwe. And they did this, what they called sanctions busting. Remember, the sanctions were intended to compel the regime to reform, but then they were trading, as was recently revealed, in gold with some other countries through unofficial means. So if the sanctions were intended to compel the government to reform, I think part of the reason why that didn't work is they found some other ways to still thrive despite the sanctions. So I think these are some of the explanations, in my view, but we can talk further about these and other issues. For now, I will end here. Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. We will talk right after Sheetal and Allison do their presentation. I was instructed through an email. We were informed that the first part of the presentation will be delivered by Sheetal, and then Allison will take over. Am I right? Okay. Sheetal, and thank you, Rekai, once more. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll try to share my screen. So hello, everyone. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor James, for this opportunity to present today on electoral reform and the power sharing immobilism problem in Mauritius. So together with my colleague, Allison McCulloch. So our topic will focus on Mauritius, and Mauritius is a small island developing state in the Indian Ocean. And a background on Mauritius. So Mauritius is very often perceived as a model of a consociational model or a modified version of consociationalism, basically because of its multi-ethnic structure. So despite this multi-ethnic structure as compared to other countries, Mauritius has always projected itself as an exception in the African continent. So Mauritius is even ranked among the first country in sub-Saharan Africa by the Mo Ibrahim Index. But although ranked first in terms of governance, so these indices, they do not really capture the electoral issues that Mauritius is facing. So Mauritius follows the Westminster system of government, and the Prime Minister is the head of government who is elected, and the President is the head of state. So since independence, so throughout its history, Mauritius has maintained long-term stability, economic development, democracy since its independence, but with exception with the 1968 ethnic riots, which followed by a state of emergency from 1971 to 1976, and the 1999 inter-ethnic disturbance. So basically, the 1999 ethnic disturbance is associated with the death of a Rastafarian singer in police custody. But however, the riot was more or less associated with the issue of the marginalization of the minority, the Creole population in Mauritius. So before we explain the issue on electoral reform and the electoral system in Mauritius, so it's important to have an overview of the ethnic profile of the population. So to note that Mauritius does not have an indigenous population. Instead, its population is derived from consecutive flows of migrants. So we have first the Portuguese who came to Mauritius, but the island remained unpopulated. So after the Portuguese, we have the Dutch who came, and after the Dutch, the French came, but remained in the country. So during the French period, slaves were mainly brought from Africa. So after the French, the British conquered the island in 1810, but slave importation continued for a while. It was only in 1835, with the abolition of slavery, then there were indentured laborers who were brought from India. And during the early 20th century, Chinese traders and Muslim merchants from the North India came to Mauritius. To say that these flows of migrants now form the population of Mauritius. So according to the Constitution of Mauritius, the population is officially classified into 4 categories. The Hindu community, which is the majority community, the Muslim community, the Sino-Mauritian community, which is the Chinese community, and the general population, which is also considered as a residual category of those who do not belong to the first 3 categories. But the general population category is rather a contested category because it comprises mainly of the elite, the Franco-Mauritian, and the minorities also, the Creole, the marginalized group also. So, but these, I'll get back to the previous slide. So I wish to highlight again that these categories, although they are classified by the Constitution into 4 categories, but they are subdivided into different streams, which is that the Hindu community, which comprises of 51%, is divided into Hindu ethnic groups, which is the Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, and the Northern Hindu is further comprised into caste. So why I'm mentioning about these categories, because these categories, they deeply have an impact on the electoral politics in Mauritius. So to say that even the Muslim group, because there are different sects involved in the Muslim group, and also the Sino-Mauritian and the general population, as I've mentioned earlier. So now to address, so coming after the ethnic profile, to address the real issues why we need an electoral reform in Mauritius, because there have been several ethno-electoral politics problems in Mauritius. So this ethnic politics problem is often associated to pre-independence negotiations between the British colonial authorities and the local political parties. So it is important to note that before independence, 1968, so Mauritius was governed by the British, but in 1948, we had a first election under a new constitution. So this was because at that point in 1948, constitutional reform was considered as a major concern for several colonies. And the colonial government decided first to broaden the franchise. That is, men and women who are 21 years above and who are able to write simple English sentences in either English or French would be able to vote. But this was the apprehension of the conservatives, the elite, because it would be an end to their rule and it will be a clear victory for the Indian population. So before coming up to the first commission on electoral system in Mauritius that was implemented in 1957 to 1958, I would like also to mention other issues associated with Mauritius. For example, now we have coalition politics, which is formed by the national political parties, but it is also important to note that national political parties in Mauritius are highly ethnicized. The leading Labour Party is often associated with the Hindu community, and the opposing parties like the PMSD is often associated with the general population, as well as the MNM or the MSM as a Hindu-dominated party. But coalition is very often formed between the Hindu majority party and the general population minority party. We have also the problem of low female representation in Mauritius. To say that in Africa, Mauritius has the lowest level of female political representation of around 1/5 in the Legislative Assembly. But the problem is that even if they are represented more because of their ethnicity rather than on their based on the gender. So other problems that we have in Mauritius is that we have also disproportionate electoral system. As most of you have observed, like we had the last general election in 2024, where the Labour Party in alliance, again, with a general population party, the MMM won 60 seats out of 62 seats in the assembly. And on the basis of 62% of the national votes, which is rather disproportionate. And we have also the issue, which is very important, is the best loser system. The best loser system has been adopted in the 1966, 1960 to 1968 negotiation to compensate for minority representation. But however, this system has also been challenged on the ground. It entrenched communalism. It is an outdated system, and also it has also invited legal challenges before the Supreme Court and the United Nations UN Human Rights Committee. So we agree that there is a need political consensus that electoral reform is needed. So Mauritius, so we had the Trustam-Eve Commission, which was set up in 1957 to 1958 to decide about the type of electoral system that would be implemented in Mauritius to ensure a fair representation of all communities, in particular the minorities, the Muslim and the Chinese. Because in previous elections, the 1948 election and 1953 elections, these minorities, the groups, the Muslim, they were not represented or not even elected. So even the Chinese. So at some point in time in the 1948 election, the Chinese, we did not even have a Chinese candidate for the election. So there were debates between different parties. The Mauritius Labour Party, often which was supported by the working class and the majority being Hindu majority, so favored the demarcation of the island into 40 single-member constituencies, whereas the opposing party, the Parti Mauricien, the Conservative, favored the demarcation of the island into 11 free-member constituencies based on a proportional representation. But eventually, the Trustam-Eve Commission also followed the Mauritius Labour Party at that time as the most stable party to come up with the division of 40 single-member constituencies. So, and for this election, it was also decided the last census would be used, the 1952 census. So a glimpse of the map that was used during the negotiation between British colonial authorities and local political parties. So here, which is available at the British National Archive, and it's very precious and not even available in Mauritius. So here in each 40 constituencies, so you'll have the composition of the population per ethnic group. So to say that after the analysis of elections of the following elections of 1959 and 1963, so the rural constituencies, these are rather Hindu dominated, mostly supported the Mauritius Labour Party, as well as the urban constituencies. But however, the island 40 constituencies sustained only for 2 elections, 1959 and 1963. And also because minorities could not be represented, so there was another constitutional conference in London to decide about a new system. So a new system of government. So eventually in 1966, so we had the Banwell Electoral Commission, who tried to come up with a better system, a better electoral system to represent basically all the communities. But the Manuel did not do much. It was only then pairing the 40 constituencies to 20, but the composition of the electoral boundaries remained the same. So, which gives the Hindus the majority of the constituencies, and also urban constituencies, though they are more component of the general population, it started to be Hindu dominated. So what the electoral system in place in Mauritius that has been decided by Manuel electoral system, we have Mauritius shall have 23 member constituencies and elected through the first past the post system. And in additional to these 62 seats, and 2 for Rodrigues, which is a remote island of Mauritius, but then 2 for better and adequate representation of the minorities. The Commission also decided that there should be 8 best loser system. The best loser system is a unique system for minority representation. But throughout the years, there have been various criticism that the best loser system is an outdated system. We need to come up with a new system to compensate the minorities. Why? Because the system used an outdated census of 1972. The 1972 census is the last population that we have on ethnic categories. Since then, we don't have an updated census for electoral purpose. And it has also been claimed that candidates will have to declare their ethnicity for the purpose of the election. And this has led to different views between parties in parliament. And also the best loser system has entrenched communalism in Mauritius. But since the past 25 years, we had a series of reforms from 2002 to 2018. So we had the Sachs Commission, and following the Sachs Commission, we had a select committee which was appointed to decide on the implementation of the Sachs Commission. But it was not really approved. We had the Carcassonne report again, which failed. We had the Sitanen report designed by an economist, which was too complicated for the Mauritian population. And before the election of 2014, we had the consultation paper on electoral reform, where the Labour Party in coalition with MMM wanted to establish a second republic, again, which failed, and the coalition lost in election. And in 2018, we had the Constitution Amendment Bill proposed by the MSM government. Again, this failed, and they failed mostly because of the proportional representation seats and the issue of the best loser seats. So now Allison will explain more about the case study on the Sachs Commission.
And I'll just take like 2 or 3 minutes because I know
Yes.
we're at time.
Yes.
So yeah, very quickly, as you see here, you've had an iterative reform process, multiple attempts. What's striking about these attempts is they're kind of similar in the sense that almost all of them recommend some kind of mixed member proportional system. But so keeping the first past the post, adding a little bit of PR seats to it. It's also been the case that both sort of major political factions have attempted to move forward with electoral reform, and there's a sort of near universal consensus that reform is needed. Yet each of these processes has ended in deadlock. And so what we do in the paper is just look at the first of these, which is a fairly extensive process. And maybe Sheena, if you could move to the next couple of slides, that'd be great. So we look at the Sachs Commission, or the 3-person commission on constitutional and electoral reform. That was led by Albie Sachs, a judge from the South African Constitutional Court, also part of the constitution writing process in post-apartheid South Africa. The Electoral Commission in India, Electoral Commissioner B.B. Tandon, and Robert Ane, a former Supreme Court judge from Mauritius. The impetus for the change, or for the establishing the commission, was that pattern of highly skewed election results, with, again, one side on more than one occasion capturing nearly all of the seats. And And the commission considered 5 different models, 4 of which were variations on MMP designed to address that disproportionality, and 1 which was dubbed fourth past the post, which would have compensated opposition parties in a manner similar to the best loser system. Ultimately, they recommended the Model C, which would keep the first past the post seats, the best loser seats, and add an additional 30 seats to it. From there, their report was sent to a select committee of parliament to determine how to move it forward. At that stage, even though the coalition government had enough seats to move forward with any sort of constitutional reforms without, they already had that majority position, things fell apart due to a split within the coalition, so leading to no consensus. The select committee report actually couldn't decide on how to do it, recommended 2 different things, and things sort of fell apart from there. And then maybe we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about how this relates to the principles on electoral integrity, it was certainly that the Sachs Commission was generally consultative, appeared to have elicited wide agreement on a number of issues. Again, had received 70 written memoranda, held 50 sessions, including, across Mauritius and in Rodriguez. Again, it was inclusive in the sense that it undertook this consultative process, even though it could have moved it forward in Parliament without doing so. The report certainly is clear about how it was assessing the different models, identifying those criteria of fairness, stability, simplicity, familiarity, and impact on national harmony and social progress. They grounded their analysis of the 5 different models in comparative data, so particularly using South Africa and India as comparable cases, but certainly putting it into the sort of larger literature on electoral reform. But of course, one of the major problems with the Commission's report was the sort of constraints put on it initially. So the scope allocated to the Commission was essentially how to add some PR to the system without, in particular, touching the best loser seats. And so it meant that they could only consider very small correctives to the existing system. In addition, the terms of reference for the Commission, there was a brief on proportional representation attached, which was basically what the government suggested should be the model to move forward. Again, they were told this was illustrative, but again, kind of indicated how they were going to move forward. So really just a sense that the terms were highly constrained. And then, of course, it fell apart later on due to an intra split. And then, so the next part for our paper, and I'll wrap up on this point, and this is the next slide, is just to think about how such an extensive process ultimately fell apart. And, in line with, the sort of general consent, there were some partisan interests that were at play. There was, it was hard to engage, or there was not as much perhaps public engagement as possible. But ultimately too, I think one of the major issues that we see here is the sort of the challenge of when you have ethnically defined seats or institutions, those are very difficult to change because of the sort of destabilization or the sort of the fears and insecurities that would go along with removing that kind of institutional protection for minority groups. So the next part of the paper we will want to focus on is really sort of teasing out again how this kind of like all of these attempts lead to deadlock and immobilism and inertia, in part because of the nature of the systems that we see in place to begin with. So I will leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both Sheetal and you, Allison, for the joint effort to depict as precisely as you could the electoral reform and overview of it. for which I am very thankful, and we are very thankful. So without further ado, and in order to keep this session within the time frame, I am passing the floor to our discussant, Emre. Emre, buyurun.
Thank you very much, Darko. Hi there, everyone. It's really fascinating to hear those papers. I'm very happy to discuss those, but unfortunately, I couldn't get the Rekai's paper on time. So what I heard is, I think, as the only thing that I can comment on. I'm terribly sorry for this. But I mean, I'll just want to keep it kind of short and to be in the precise prescription that Toby just sent me about how to do this review. So I'll just comment on some strengths and weaknesses of these papers within the limits of historical context, electoral reform over 20-year period, and so on and so forth with this heading. So keep it quite clear. And again, quite sorry for Rekai, I couldn't do this, but I would be more than happy if you can send the paper to me afterwards, if you want to hear that. And then, you know, I can just send you the comments. So starting with the Venezuela paper, I really enjoyed. It's a kind of a very important paper because, I mean, most probably you know what's going on in Turkey at the moment. And these countries are kind of, you know, the ones that we can relate to. So it is quite interesting to learn about these countries. I have to confess, I'm not an expert on those countries. And it's so the things that I just want to mention are the ones that I just think will strengthen the paper, basically. So for the historical context and political background for the Venezuelan paper, it's an excellent critical contextualization of democratic erosion, first thing first, and how did it transform itself to authoritarianism, and it's clearly outlined constitutional mechanisms and roles of electoral institutions like CNE and so on and so forth. It has some rich and clear delineation of loss of independence of electoral and judicial powers, which I can relate to. But at the same time, I think it's kind of, you know, this paper can benefit from potentially, it potentially overlooked the nuances or contradictions in earlier democratic periods. So it may kind of refer to that periods as well, rather than a binary characterization of democratic versus authoritarian process. It will make the paper much more richer. And it's a kind of an perhaps again it might be beneficial to kind of make a comparison with the wider Latin American political contexts, so that we can have a deeper understanding of how did it happen in the Venezuelan context, so we can relate it to the other ones. I'm not saying that it should be a comparative paper, but we can benefit from this because it's a very important case. About electoral reforms over the 20-year period, I mean, the paper just kind of, you know, identified in a quite really clear manner how electoral legislation served regime consolidation. It's really nice to hear those. It has a detailed and convincing discussion of abusive electoral reforms. And I really like the term of delegalization. It's just like, I mean, it's underlining a potential with the underlining the procedural irregularities within the processes. But at the same time, I think there might be some kind of additions which it predominantly focused on regime actions. Rather than at the same time kind of underestimating the reactive or strategic role played by opposition groups. I mean, it might be beneficial to kind of refer to some kind of what happened within the opposition groups while all of these happening. So it might be a kind of, you know, it will provide some depth, of course, with the civil society efforts, not only the opposition, but also, if any, of course. The paper in its current form offers little exploration of international or domestic civil society efforts influencing or challenging reforms, how they relate to those reforms. Because I mean it's in these authoritarian analysis we usually stick with the idea of focusing on the ones who are governing, who are in power versus the others. But then we basically ignore what part of the others are consist of. So they react to these reforms, especially in a democratic backsliding context, in different ways. So it might be beneficial to focus on how these different groups basically just respond to these changes. The case study is quite strong. I just want to say that it's like recent and continuous issue strong selections of these voting from abroad. It clearly basically illustrated the authoritarian electoral manipulation within the context that it's talking about. But also it's basically, can we kind of go beyond that voting abroad issue, for example, right? Can we some kind of, provide some other examples? Additional comparisons with others, again, some other countries as well might be beneficial. And also, the paper has kind of a limited discussion about actual political or societal reactions to those electoral manipulations, right? So how did the public respond to that? How did, which could open understanding of political consequences, because at the same time we need some kind of discussion about how did these changes, showed their relevance within the public. So that might be an interesting thing to look at. I think it will again will enrich the discussion. It has sharp critical analysis. The paper clearly assigned like GNSEE principles, identified profound deviations, abuses of electoral reforms, and so on and so forth. Again, here it might be kind of, with a few examples of how did it end, right? What's the consequence of these all? These all happened. It's a very detailed exploration of what happened, what was the issue, but it rarely touches upon the issues about what was the consequences. So it is a kind of an important thing, because I mean, for the Turkish case, it's a kind of a very different thing. When we had these electoral problems in Turkey, it contributed to democratic maturation. I mean, it's an unexpected thing, right? But we can see that. But in most of the cases, it's basically when you have a democratic backsliding or when you have such kind of problems, it deepens the problems of democratic consolidation, and it just contributes to democratic backsliding. But in the Turkish case, the outcome, which was quite important, was basically just the opposite. So is that the situation in this particular case? If the paper can touch upon the consequences of each cases that I mentioned, might be kind of a more interesting one. Well, these are the things that I will talk about the Venezuelan paper now, and I just want to talk about the Mauritius paper. Again, I really like that. It's basically it's very exciting. It's a kind of a luxury. Someone talking about a context about you do not know anything at all, which was done in a very, very good way. So, and it's clear outline of historical and constitutional context. I mean, when we talk about the historical context and political background, including in-depth descriptions of electoral structures, best loser system, evolution of democratic processes, it's really nice to see and learn. Clearly, it articulated the Mauritius' consistent democratic trajectory and political stability. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know if I might be mistaken, but it highlighted too much historical narrative of early constitutional periods. We are kind of, mostly interested in what's happening now. So basically, perhaps these detailed, very nice at the same time. Historical narrative sometimes obscures insights and specific constitutional roles of modern actors, of institutions, right? So again, it's kind of the focus. I think it's very nice, although it's very nice to see what has happened in the past, but I think it just necessitates some kind of what's happening now or in more recent times, so that we can link this historical development. It has also a rich coverage of multiple reform efforts, clear identification like these reforms, Sachs, Kasasrom, Sitanen, if I pronounced them correctly. It just provides a beautiful timeline for anyone to understand. It just explains to the reader why electoral reforms failed despite the broad acknowledgement of their necessity. But at the same time, again, like in the Venezuelan paper, I think we need some, since I'm not an expert, it's the kind of an idea. I mean, it might be irrelevant, right? So please excuse me if that's the case. But I think we need some kind of exploration of the role played by civil society and international actors. That might kind of, which shifts the focus from that elitist-centric reform process that you have described. So, I mean, we are not living in isolated cases. We are not living in an isolated world nowadays. It's impossible, although that was the case because it's an isolated, geographical content, but still it might be quite beneficial. And it's also, I think, it just overly focuses on political elites and then neglecting in a way that what's happening at the grassroots level. So, I mean, how did people basically, the voters, because this is a kind of a, issue about voters at the same time, how did they respond to those? Support or did not support these electoral reforms? It might kind of, again, add a kind of an in-depth analysis. Sachs Commission case study, internal case study is well developed. It's richly detailed, clearly defined the political context. Again, as I said, but at the same time, for example, this paper can benefit about some criticisms about these reports. Okay, yes, they have contributed a lot. Yes, they have introduced a lot. Yes, but what were the basic points what were the lacking points of these reports or these interventions in a way? So how genuinely inclusive or merely symbolic was those reports? How did they relate to public? How did they relate to daily life? How did they, although they are kind of bureaucratic mechanisms, they offer some kind of some mechanisms at the state level, I would say. What was the repercussions? Well, how did the public respond to those? Did they understand it? You just mentioned throughout your presentation, but at the same time, what was the reaction of the public to those reforms and stuff? The PR-based solutions were the best route. You discussed limited discussion on alternative electoral reforms. This might be the issue. I mean, this is a hypothetical one. Yes, these reforms have happened, but we know the other alternatives. We know the other solutions to these kind of problems. I mean, might be speculative, but it will kind of what if that was not the situation. So basically, these were the things that I'm talking about. Again, since I'm not an expert on both countries, these are the things that I'm just focused on about how to enrich the papers, both papers, and also the Rekai's one. Also, the Zimbabwe one is a very nice one. But since I couldn't read the paper, I could not comment on those. But all these three papers will do kind of great contributions to this edited volume, which is a great effort by Toby. And I don't know if you're doing this alone, Toby, or with some kind of colleagues. So it's a very nice. I really enjoyed both the pieces, and this is the end of my evaluation.
And I'm passing on now to Toby and to Tanya Holston from WFD to bring this to the end.
Thank you so much, Darko. So I promised at the start of the conference that I'd finish with some concluding thoughts. We're in extra time, so I'm not going to give a conclusion, partly because of time, but also because I don't feel as if I should have the final word, because there are many voices that are here, and also this is an unfinished work. It will be a book, and the book is in progress at the moment. I just wanted very, 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 very quickly flag some common themes, though. We began this conference talking about the need for research on electoral reform. There's lots of research on whether election laws are good or bad, but not much on how we do electoral reform. we smashed that. There is now research out there. It's on the website. It's available on this topic. And we looked at the GenSay principles, the 6 principles that were kind of published last year. And we introduced these 5 questions at the start of the conference as well. So to what extent were the principles followed? What were the barriers? What were the consequences of not following them? And what interventions can be put in place? So just some common themes very quickly. The first one is electoral laws and electoral reform really matters. And this came across all the panels and all the papers. I mean, we knew this already. It's not a new finding, but again, it just shows across so many jurisdictions around the world the really severe consequences that good or bad electoral reforms can have. And there's so many papers that speak to that theme. Which principles should underpin the electoral reform process? Well, it could be the GenSay principles, but this is a democracy and there's many voices here. And so we discussed the GenSay principles and thought about the strengths and the weaknesses of them. Some people suggested that maybe consensus was the most important of these principles out of all of them. Other people suggested that maybe these principles were really important guidelines that we should have as aspirations to follow, but maybe also there's some critical tensions in there too, and maybe we can't follow all of these principles all of the time. And some people pointed out that, well, we can have good electoral reforms being passed that don't actually necessarily follow the test of the principles, and that can be quite a puzzle. But I guess if that is the case, and we discard the principles, then how do we know what is a good electoral reform? It was noted that agreement and consensus might be a very high threshold, and maybe, I think, Darko suggested that maybe sufficient consensus, or maybe just consensus on key principles was enough. Were the principles followed globally? These slides I've been writing as people have been talking, so that they're not conclusive in any kind of sense. But I think the key thing is there are a very mixed picture. There is good practices. There has been good practices around the world in the past, things that we can learn from. But clearly also lots of breaches and lots of violations of these principles around the world before. And actually, when you look at particular countries, as we've seen from the presentations here, the situation is very nuanced. The principle can kind of be partially fulfilled, but not completely. And there's this puzzle about, often in autocracies, for example, electoral reform, it can be a mechanism, people pointed out, for autocratization. And maybe we shouldn't call it, therefore, electoral reform, because maybe electoral reform is something, it's a solution, it's a positive phrase. And we should think about these measures in a different way. I think it's really important to try to compare electoral reforms against these principles, but I think as the authors can kind of carry on this kind of conversation, I'll just put these in here initially, it can be quite difficult as well. So I suggested earlier on that the UK didn't do very well in terms of developing consensus. Is that lack of consensus over voter ID comparable in terms of the lack of consensus in Venezuela, or is there some kind of qualitative difference there? I think there's something to still sort of think about. We did see, I think, probably some good examples of what happens when electoral principles are not followed. Bad elections follow as a result, but also you can have poorly designed electoral laws. A really interesting example, I think, earlier on in the conference from India, for example, where it was a finance committee looking at electoral finance laws, and that's not where the expertise is on elections, and as a result, things that could have been prevented were not prevented. So what are the barriers to the principles? I think part of this is about political agency. It's about executive pressure from above. It's also about the absence, as it were, of political will, but it's also about political institutions. Where you have majoritarian political institutions and there's less barriers or incentives for consensus, this can be a problem going forward. Polarized political communities came through many of the discussions as well, particularly the US in Toby's presentation there. So lots of good points, and also some serious issues in terms of what the interventions are. We can make that can address this. This is the conversation to have. So very briefly, just to finish, I would add my thanks to the team surrounding me, Darko and Sophie, to all the presenters, all the delegates for the comments and questions, the discussants as well, but particularly also to Tanya and the Westminster Foundation team for all the work that they've done to support us. And I'll hand the floor over to Tanya briefly.
Hey, Toby. Yes, thank you very much. It's going to be very briefly. Unfortunately, I have to dash out. I would like to thank everybody who took part in this conference. It was extremely interesting. I learned so much on all the different topics, specifically the one on the consensus, which I really need to think about again. And we need to go back to Gensai and see if we have to adapt the principles at one point, add other words to it, as we heard this morning from the Russia presentation that I found really intriguing, of the principles being used for performances, so that I also found very interesting. Yeah, we will go back, and it's a living document. So please, if you have any comments on it, just let us know as well. And we try to make it better as we go along. And I hope that we will be able, apart from the book, which Toby will create, and we work with you on this one in the coming year, that we will do more on the topic as much as we can. So to get it out into the world a little bit more popular, I hope. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, everyone. Take care and keep in touch. And look out for our future EIP conferences as well. They're all on the website. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.